continue a series of lessons started a couple weeks ago on the identity of Jesus. He's never been more popular than he is now, but he's probably never been more misunderstood and more lightly taken than he's ever been before. So it's essential that we as believers go back to the fundamentals of exactly who Jesus is, because as Paul taught in 1 Corinthians 15, he's the center of our faith. And if he is not who he claimed to be, we believe in vain, and everything we do, and especially being here this morning, is all in vain. But if he is exactly who he claimed to be, the Son of God, both God and man, while upon the earth, the answer to our problem with sin, he is our everything. And we live and breathe, and we face the future all because of him. And we want to look now at the evidence for simply, did he exist? Or is he simply a mythical figure, someone that was invented by the early Christian believers? Was he someone of simply of legend that was later on described as a real person? Or should be seen exactly as who he claimed to be, that is a real person? So we'll look this morning at, did Jesus really live? Go ahead, Linda, and bring that up. And this is simply the test of social science. Science is the best friend of Christianity. We don't need this best friend, but science is the best friend because it confirms things Scripture already says is true. There are the hard sciences, mathematical science, biological science, the science of physical science, such as physics, things like that. But there's also social science. When you study psychology or sociology or study history, and I'm a history teacher, you're studying social science. There are things that you look at to confirm whether or not things are true, and those things can be applied to the Christian faith. And these are the questions we'll look at this morning. First of all, does the Bible present Jesus as a real person? If it doesn't present Jesus as real, there's no bother trying to prove he's real, but the Bible does present him as real. Do sources outside of the Bible confirm Jesus' existence? Even though the Bible has its own ultimate degree of credibility, some still want to know, well, what about outside the Bible? Does it refer to Jesus? Do people talk about Jesus? And do historians today regard Jesus as a real person? Not only believing historians, but unbelieving historians. Do they consider him a real person? Well, why is this important? Why prove that Jesus really lived? First of all, Christianity rests upon his claims. Paul stated that in the passage we read at the beginning of the service, 1 Corinthians 15. The identity of Jesus sets Christianity itself apart. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the what? Life. No one comes to the Father but through me. This is an exclusive claim. No one else has made such a claim and backed it up. Everyone else who would say such a thing, if I started saying such a thing, you would politely excuse me out of the building because I would not be seen as being someone in my right mind. But this is exactly what Jesus said, which sets Christianity apart from all other religions. Jesus is the only answer to death. John 11:25, I am the resurrection and the life. Though a man dies, he will live. And he said this right before he raised Lazarus from the dead. And then John 3:16, he is our life. For God so loved the world, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So these questions deserve a serious consideration because of exactly who Jesus is. And can we place our life with his life? Well, let's look at the social science. Let's look at the evidence. First of all, the Bible presents Jesus as a real person. There's a lot of stuff. I know Ricardo's really good about taking notes, but he's already exhausted. I cannot keep up with this. I can print this out. If I had more time this morning, I would have. If you just want to just absorb this morning, I can print it out. I can send it to you in a link or something like that. Just kind of take all this in. It's kind of designed to kind of just overwhelm you with how much evidence there is. Then you can kind of soak it in a little deeper later. But first of all, the Bible presents Jesus as a real person. Never as a myth, never like a John Bunyan type character, never as a legend or someone who just was a ghostly figure. The Bible always treats him historically. Look at some examples of this. Just look in the Gospel of Luke. The Gospel of Luke, Notice what Luke tells us in verses 1 through 3, and then look what he provides in the next few verses. Luke, in his account of Jesus, says this: many have undertaken to draw up, this is chapter 1, verse 1 through 3, many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those from the first who were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you might know what? So that you might know the certainty of the things you've been taught. Luke's basically saying, I'm not playing around here. I've gathered together eyewitness accounts, and he simply wants early Christians to know, here's the order of what Jesus did and what he taught. You've heard all the eyewitnesses. I've just gathered together all the information because maybe you did not see this or you've just heard about it. And he says, I want you to be certain of what you believe. He's telling us he's dealing with fact and not fiction. Look at chapter 2. As he begins the early beginnings of the life of Jesus on the earth, he roots himself in Roman history. Chapter 2, verse 1, Luke writes, in those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. Here he's rooting himself right in first century Rome that occupied the area that would be later called Palestine, the state of Israel today. But he's not talking about a galaxy far, far away or a land far, far away or a time long ago that's somehow some kind of mythical area or imaginative area. He's rooting himself in historical people and places. Look at chapter 3 now. Look at the people that have all been verified as existing even outside of the Bible. Luke 3, 1 through 3, this is a census. It says, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip, tetrarch of Iturea, and Trachonitis, Lysanias, tetrarch of Abilene, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. So here John the Baptist is introduced, but notice how Luke introduces John the Baptist. He gives all the Roman leaders at that time, from the Caesar all the way down to the Roman leader put in charge of the area where John lived, and even the Jewish leaders. He's digging in deep to show exactly when these things happened. He's not saying, hey, just believe that he existed, just believe that John did this and John did that. Every one of these Roman leaders has been verified outside of the Bible itself as a real person by archaeological evidence that has been found. So as far as the treatment of Jesus in the Bible, he encountered many people. People interacted with him, not with a myth or a legend. He encountered outsiders, people that were non-believers, Pilate, Herod. He was associated with real places and events and affirmed by eyewitnesses. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he was seen in his resurrected form by over 500 brethren at once. So the Bible always treats him as a real person. In fact, it's a non-issue. It's just, was he who he claimed to be? It wasn't, did he exist? Was he the Son of God? Did he prove himself to be the fulfillment of prophecy and prove himself through his miracles to be the Son of God, not a real person? The Bible just establishes that right off the bat. So it was always treated historically. But could Jesus have been invented, though? Could he have been invented? H.G. Wells, famous author of 1984, simply says that is not possible. These are non-believers talking about, could Jesus have just been invented in the mind of people? He says, here was a man, this part of the tale could not have been invented. In other words, his life is too extensive and the evidence too overwhelming to simply say someone made him up. William Durant, in his great historical work, Caesar and Christ, said this, that a few simple men in one generation have invented so powerful and appealing personality, so lofty an ethic, and so inspiring a vision of human brotherhood would be a miracle far more incredible than any of those recorded in the Gospels. So people that study history outside of the Bible say, you just couldn't invent someone like Jesus, such a complicated figure and such an extensive figure that's had this kind of profound influence throughout the world. People that are just made up people don't have this kind of influence. So the early church could not have made him up and pawned him off as being real. So the Bible treats him as a real person and not an invented person. What about non-biblical sources? What do people outside of the Bible say? A lot of people say, well, I want to look at some other sources. Jesus' existence is affirmed by non-biblical sources. His existence is affirmed by people that were not believers, but people that simply looked at evidence for things happening being real. Just like people today look at the history of our presidents. I looked at a documentary on the plane flying back from the islands on the history of some of our presidents, and historical evidence was presented for them, and I simply looked at that, and because I didn't live during their time, the 7th president of the United States, but I want to know how he lived. So historians tell me about it. There are 4 historians that were contemporary to the life of Christ and the early church that speak about Jesus. They were not believers, simply people that wrote history, documented things right around the time of Jesus. Tacitus, considered the greatest historian of ancient Rome. Suetonius, chief secretary of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. Pliny, Roman governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, and the Jewish historian Josephus. All contemporaries of either Jesus himself or of the early church. And they wrote about Christ or referenced him, but they themselves were not believers. They were just writing down what was true at that time. Let's look at some of their quotations. First of all, that of Suetonius, lived 117 to 138 AD, and Tacitus, 55 to 120 AD. First of all, Tacitus, what did he say? These are people speaking about Jesus that weren't part of the Bible itself. He wrote the Annals of Rome between the death of Caesar Augustus and the death of Caesar Nero. Here's what he writes at one point about the fires set in Rome in relation to this man named Christus. Here's what Tacitus writes. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Then he says, Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. So here he is, this Roman historian, simply mentioning Christ and how he has suffered this extreme penalty by the reign of Tiberius, or during the reign of Tiberius, by Pontius Pilate. So here you have this cross-referencing of Roman historical writers writing down the very things that are written down in the gospel accounts. You don't find conflict, you don't find dates or names out of place. You find a perfect congruence. But someone writing outside the Bible about the existence of Christ. Suetonius, 117 to 138 AD. He compiled biographies of the first 12 Roman Caesars. In his work, The Life of Claudius, he mentions Christ in reference to the Jewish expulsion from Rome under Claudius. This is mentioned in Acts 18, 1 through 2. Talks about Aquila and Priscilla had left Rome under the reign of Claudius because he wanted to get rid of the trouble that was brewing up in Rome. And Suetonius simply writes about continuous disturbances at the instigation of Christus. So they're referring to Jesus, people outside the Bible, as actually living, not some imaginary Jesus, but an actual Jesus. 2 more. A man by the name of Pliny, 111 AD, and Josephus, 37 and 97 AD. Pliny the Younger wrote letters to the Roman Emperor Trajan about the handling of Christians. He mentions Christ when discussing perceived Christian practices. They, the Christians, he wrote, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day. That's our first day of the week. Before it was light, they sang in alternate verses, like we have done, a hymn to Christ as God. So here, Pliny the Third now, Roman historian, simply mentioning Christ as an actual person, not saying, well, this person they talked about, but we never confirmed lived. they're mentioning Christ just as solidly as the New Testament writers mention him. Josephus wrote from 37 to 97 AD. His most famous work, The Antiquities of the Jews, he wrote of Christ and his followers, and he writes, "Now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ, and when Pilate, at the suggestion of a principal man among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive a third day." Here another historian, a fourth historian, not a believer, never baptized, never professed any level of commitment to Christ, but simply acknowledges that he existed and writes about him as anyone else would be written about as a real person. The third and last area we'll look at this morning is simply Jesus has been acknowledged by credible historians. These are credible social scientists. We'll go through some of their quotes real briefly. Gary Habermas, F.F. Bruce, John Stuart Mill, Otto Benz, Gyla Cornfield, and the Google of its day, the Encyclopedia Britannica. Let's just look at some of these quotes by simply historians as they look at whether or not Jesus was a real person. First of all, believers that have mastered the languages, have mastered history. One of the most famous, he's long passed, but his name is F.F. Bruce, Ryland Professor, University of Manchester, England. He writes this about whether or not Jesus could have been a fake person, whether or not he was made up or whether or not he was real. He writes this in his book, The New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? He writes, "Some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do not do so on the grounds of historical evidence. The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. It is not historians who propagate the Christ myth theories." Here, F.F. Bruce is simply summing up where historians are. He says historians know Jesus lived. It's just an issue of who he really was. But anyone, whether they be a YouTube person or someone who's written some kind of book or a blogger that simply says Jesus didn't ever live, he simply says they have to catch up. They're not really with it because historians are long gone from that question of whether or not Jesus lived. He did live. It's who he claimed to be, which is the question. Gary Habermas, another believer, a professor of history at Liberty University, he wrote in his book, Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? He says, within 100 to 150 years after the birth of Christ, approximately 18 non-Christian extra-biblical sources from secular history mention more than 100 facts, beliefs, and teachings from the life of Christ, including almost every detail of Jesus' life, including miracles, the resurrection, and his claims to be deity. Simply, there's too many references outside the Bible itself for someone simply to deny Jesus existed. He's simply documenting the quantity of them. Let's now look at non-believers and what they've said about, did Jesus really exist? If you study a philosophy class, you're going to run into John Stuart Mill. I did, University of South Florida. Good writer, a little overwhelming in everything he says, but philosopher, lived from 1806 to 1873. In his work, The Essays on Nature, the Unity of Religion and Theism, he says this: it is of no use to say that Christ, as exhibited in the Gospels, is not historical. Let's just read that again. He says it's of no use to say he's not historical. Who among his disciples or among their proselytes was capable of inventing the sayings ascribed to Jesus, or of imagining the life and character revealed in the Gospels? Certainly not the fishermen of Galilee, still less the early Christian writers. John Stuart Mill is simply saying his character is too deep. And what he taught is too extensive beyond any morality that anyone has ever even entertained. To say the early Christians just lied and made him up, but yet gave him the great truths that are presented on the Sermon on the Mount, he says that has no credibility. And this man, again, is not a believer, but he's simply stating where historians are at. He's a real person, clearly, but is he the Son of God, which we'll look at in weeks to come. Otto Betz, noted Jewish historian, wrote a book entitled What Do We Know About Jesus in 1968. He simply said this in the book. He said, no serious scholar has ventured the non-historicity of Jesus. He's simply telling people that tried denying Jesus existed, he's simply saying, don't take him seriously. We left that place again a long time ago. There's too much evidence that he really lived. Again, he's not a believer. Guy Kornfeld, another Jewish historian, writer, publisher, he wrote a book. I have this in my own library at home, called The Historical Jesus, a scholarly view of the man in his world. He writes this early on in the book about just how solid the evidence for Jesus is. He says, modern archaeology and scholarship have now established beyond a shadow of a doubt that a man known as Jesus certainly did exist in history, and that the criticism of the skeptics who denied his existence was ill-founded. Drawing upon our knowledge of the authentic contemporary milieu as well as the written records, we are able to assert beyond a shadow of a doubt that historical Jesus existed. What he's referring to is a time in the late 1800s where knowledge was not as extensive as it is now. And there used to be a group of people that, this Jesus didn't really ever live. Again, he's saying we're long past that now. We know too much. And that's a value of science. It's a value of social science. We move forward at light speed because people are constantly looking, and AI is going to be our friend as well because it can gather information quickly. This is simply where they're at in the 1980s, simply saying we know for sure he lived. The Google of its time, Encyclopedia Britannica, in 1974, the 15th edition, used 20,000 words to describe Jesus. More space was devoted to Jesus than Aristotle, Cicero, Alexander, Julius Caesar, Buddha, Confucius, Muhammad, or Napoleon. You don't give that kind of space to someone who's not even real. In the Britannica, the comment on the many independent, non-biblical references to Jesus, the Britannica simply said this. Again, this is a Google of their time. These independent accounts prove that in ancient times, even the opponents of Christianity never doubted the historicity of Jesus, which was disputed for the first time and on inadequate grounds by several authors at the end of the 18th century and during the 19th and at the beginning of the 20th. Again, it's never been doubted until this very skeptical period of time, and then it's now been dismissed. There's numbers of books as we end. If you want to look at this, Gary Habermas's book, The Verdict of History, F.F. Bruce's book, Jesus and Christian Origins Outside the New Testament, Jesus, Man or Myth, Blaylock, He Walked Among Us, Josh McDowell. The material out there to look at is extensive. We'll end with this last slide. I thought this quote was interesting. Dan Story, in his excellent book, Defending Your Faith, How to Answer the Tough Questions, he says this about those who question whether or not Jesus lived. He says, those few remaining hardcore critics who try to dismiss the abundance of facts proving Jesus' historicity to be consistent would have to do the same with about everyone else in recorded history. If all the evidence pointing to Jesus is wrong, then so is the evidence pointing to Socrates, Caesar, Augustus, Galileo, name your person. No one's historical reality is well substantiated as is Jesus. It is of no question that we're dealing with a real person. That's why the Bible spends zero time with it. It was not an issue. But the issue is Jesus asked his disciples, Who do you say that I am? Some were saying, well, you're John the Baptist, or you're this, or you're that. But when he asked Peter, what did Peter say? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Peter knew who Jesus was, and that's our challenge today, is to go the next step now to see not only that he lived, that's a no-brainer, historically, according to science, but is he as the Son of God, and what evidence would we garnish and bring together to show that he is? We'll look at that in the weeks to come. But know this for certain this morning, your faith is founded upon fact. Social science affirms it. We don't need it, but it does affirm it. The Bible is the source of our truth, though, about who Jesus is as the Son of God. Keep exploring these truths. Keep deepening your faith through studying the life of Jesus. You'll never exhaust the great truths that are there concerning who he is and how he changed your life forever. We're going to stand together in just a moment to sing a song to encourage us to further connect our faith in Jesus to what is real in this life that we live today, to not be disconnected, to not be distant from Jesus, but again, to further devote our life to him. But if you've never devoted your life at all, you're not wasting your time when you pursue knowing about Jesus. He will change your life, both now and in the future, and you'll live forever with your God. Where else is there an answer? To whom would you go, as Peter said? To whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. Jesus is the answer.